I watched the trains arrive, loaded with silence and locked doors. My superiors told me to erase the records. I didn't. Each forged manifest they handed me, I copied in secret. Now they're gone, and my ledger is the only proof they ever existed. I was just a clerk. But I remembered every number. In early September 1944, the Western Front of the Second World War was in a state of rapid flux. The Allied forces had liberated Paris just weeks earlier, and German lines were retreating across Belgium and northern France. The Reich's transportation system, once a model of logistical efficiency, was now overwhelmed by shifting priorities, fuel shortages, and the constant threat of Allied air attacks. Rail hubs that once moved troops with precision now functioned in a state of chaotic overload. Under this strain, even the most tightly controlled operations began to show signs of disarray. In the heart of this logistical maze was the town of Celle, located in Lower Saxony. Positioned along critical rail corridors between Hanover, Hamburg, and Berlin, Celle's railway depot had become an essential node in the increasingly desperate efforts to move prisoners, personnel, and equipment out of the way of advancing Allied armies. By the late summer of 1944, the region's rail yards processed dozens of trains per day, some hauling Wehrmacht units, others carrying forced laborers, and a growing number tasked with moving prisoners from vulnerable camps in the west to more secure locations deeper inside Germany. Station clerk Friedrich Reimann, age 54, had been working for the Reichsbahn since before the Nazi rise to power. With a reputation for quiet precision, he had long prided himself on maintaining order amid the complexity of wartime schedules. Reimann was not a party member. He had never been required to join. His competence, and the sheer demand for experienced railway personnel, had made him indispensable. He kept to his duties, asked few questions, and maintained fastidious records of every shipment, every locomotive, every delay. On the morning of September 11, 1944, Reimann arrived at the Celle freight depot as usual. The platforms were already bustling with activity. A military detachment was overseeing the refueling of a troop train bound for Berlin, while two civilian passenger cars, strangely out of place, sat attached to the rear of a sealed freight convoy parked on Siding 3. The locomotive engineer had reported the entire train as a standard munitions shipment originating from Kassel, but the inclusion of non-standard passenger stock raised Reimann's attention. He approached the yard manifest clipboard, housed in a locked cabinet, and began reviewing the documents accompanying the Kassel convoy. The manifest listed the train under classification G3497, originating from a secondary yard near Buchenwald. The cargo was recorded as industrial materials, security priority, and carried a security clearance signature from a Hauptsturmführer R. Zoller of the SS. Such documentation, while uncommon, was not without precedent. The SS frequently used their own logistics paperwork, especially for prisoner transports or clandestine material movements. Still, the presence of the two passenger cars, marked with Reichsbahn numbers but bearing blacked-out windows, suggested something outside the usual procedures. Reimann was no stranger to irregularities. Wartime had brought with it a relaxation of many peacetime standards. Improvisation was common. But something about this convoy's paperwork did not align. The clearance code listed on the SS documentation did not match the Reichsbahn's Central Archive reference for that classification number. He double-checked it against the most recent logistics bulletin posted in the dispatch office. The discrepancy was small, a single-digit transposition in the routing code, but it was enough to make the train appear bound for Frankfurt rather than its actual direction, which was northeast toward Neuengamme, near Hamburg. According to regulations, such inconsistencies required formal flagging and review by the local Wehrmacht transport liaison. But in practice, very few dared to question trains carrying SS authority. Reimann, aware of both the bureaucratic risk and the consequences of delay, logged the train's arrival in his ledger without comment. He included a small asterisk beside the routing code, an internal notation he used to track irregular entries. That was as far as he intended to go. At least initially. Later that afternoon, as the freight yard grew quieter under the threat of an incoming air raid, Reimann returned to the siding. The train had not yet departed. The locomotive crew had been reassigned to an emergency hospital train scheduled to arrive from Hanover, and no replacement had yet been found. The delay gave Ryman additional time. He stepped onto the small maintenance platform beside the lead freight car and walked its length, casually noting the car numbers. When he reached the passenger wagons, he noticed they were padlocked from the outside. Faint movement inside one of them caught his attention, a shadow passing behind the blacked-out glass. Again, not unusual in itself. But another inconsistency gnawed at him. The passenger cars bore the insignia of a civilian long-haul route, decommissioned the previous year. Those cars should not have been in service, let alone part of a military freight convoy. Ryman, bound by habit, made another note in his ledger. He included the full car numbers and circled them. The next morning, the train was gone. Reassigned engineers had taken it north during the night. The discrepancy remained logged only in Ryman's private files, which he kept separate from official Reichsbahn submissions. But it was not the last time such an anomaly would occur. Over the next 2 weeks, 3 more SS-controlled freight trains passed through Cell, each bearing irregular paperwork, unusual rolling stock configurations, and similar internal routing contradictions. Ryman, increasingly uneasy, began comparing his notes with older manifests. A pattern began to emerge. Each of these trains carried designation codes that tied them to security relocations from camps in the west, Buchenwald, Natzweilerstruthof, and Fort de Killieu among them. And each time, the routing data contained minor errors, transposed digits, outdated station codes, or incorrect yard references. These were not simply clerical mistakes. They were deliberate obfuscations, designed to bypass standard Reichsbahn logging procedures and ensure the trains remained unnoticed amid the general transport chaos of the collapsing Reich. Ryman did not view himself as a resistor or a dissident. He was, above all, a technician, a man of ledgers, codes, and schedules. But he understood systems, and he knew when they were being manipulated. His notes grew more detailed. He began quietly preserving carbon copies of SS transport manifests that crossed through his depot. By October, he had collected 9 such examples, each with small, deliberate inconsistencies. Some bore the names of SS officers who did not appear in the Reichsbahn's transport liaison directory. Others listed non-existent stations as points of origin. It was during the review of a 10th such document, this one tied to a transport originating from an abandoned subcamp near Metz, that Ryman found the mistake that would later draw unwanted attention. The manifest listed a series of freight car numbers that did not correspond to any entries in the Reichsbahn's central car registry. Not reassigned or out of service, simply non-existent. The car numbers had been fabricated. At first, he assumed a copying error. But cross-referencing with 3 other train schedules revealed a duplication of the same phantom numbers used across different convoys. Ryman had discovered a logistical ghost, an entire layer of fabricated freight cars, inserted into the system by the SS, moving through the rail network under cover of manifest confusion. By the end of October, as Cell's yards operated under near-continuous pressure, Ryman had begun drafting a private report. Not for superiors. Not even for the Reichsbahn. He did not know yet for whom the report was intended. He simply felt the need to record what he was seeing. He did not yet realize that one of the manifest sheets he copied, specifically the one associated with convoy G3512, would later be intercepted during a separate investigation into missing prisoners from Fort de Killieu. Nor did he know that his small annotations, those asterisks, circles, and underlined digits, would help expose a hidden SS transfer program operating outside the oversight of the Reich Ministry of Transport. At the time, it was simply a matter of professional concern. A system that no longer obeyed its own rules. A pattern that suggested concealment, not error. Ryman filed his notes under a locked drawer in the dispatch office. The war was far from over, but the rails no longer hid everything. By November 1944, the Reich's rail infrastructure had entered a phase of crisis management. Allied bombings had turned major junctions into charred debris fields, and entire swathes of track remained unusable for days at a time. Yet trains continued to run, often rerouted through rural stations like Cell, where security was looser and questions fewer. The SS, long accustomed to exploiting the rail network for discrete prisoner movements, adjusted its tactics accordingly. What had once been official transfers between camps now devolved into shadow operations, conducted under layers of falsified documentation, unusual car assignments, and ambiguous security orders. For Friedrich Reimann, these months became a period of increasing strain. He continued to perform his duties at the Cell Freight Depot, logging convoys, dispatching locomotives, and coordinating track assignments, all while quietly expanding the scope of his observations. His notes grew methodical. Train numbers, car counts, arrival and departure times. He now kept 2 sets of records, one for Reichsbahn superiors and another for himself, hidden in a repurposed tool cabinet beneath the station's signal control room. He was not alone in his unease. A junior dispatcher named Martin Kohler, recently transferred from Kassel, had begun asking cautious questions about a series of trains routed through Cell under SS authority. Unlike Reimann, Kohler had limited experience with such transfers and had assumed they followed standard procedure. But one morning in mid-November, Kohler approached Reimann with an odd query. "There was a train last night, E3589, he said, bound for Neuengamme. The manifest says it originated in Nancy, but the routing shows Saarbrücken. I tried to confirm the rail pass with the regional office, but they didn't have it logged." Reimann, who had quietly logged G3589 himself, opened his private ledger and traced the entry. The train had included 12 freight cars and a single SS-escorted passenger coach. It had departed during blackout hours and bypassed standard departure protocol. Reimann offered a neutral reply. "Best not to pursue it. If the SS wants it quiet, they'll bury the trail." Kohler hesitated. "But isn't the routing supposed to?" "It doesn't matter," Reimann cut in. "Just mark it cleared." The warning hung in the air, not as threat but as advice. Reimann recognized in Kohler the impulse that had once stirred in himself, a desire for consistency, for the system to make sense. But there was no sense to be found in these trains. Only layers of evasion. The problem, however, was not limited to irregular paperwork. By late November, the trains themselves began to reflect the growing desperation of the SS. Convoys arrived without full security detachments. Freight cars normally assigned to coal or munitions bore human cargo, and sometimes the conditions within were catastrophic. On November 28, a train arriving from Natzweiler via Metz stalled just outside Cell due to a damaged brake line. When repair crews arrived, they found several of the sealed freight cars emitting a sickly stench. No guards were present, only a single SS courier who refused to answer questions. The train was quickly rerouted to a secondary siding under orders from Berlin. Reimann logged the event, but his internal notes recorded a stark observation. Cargo presumed human. No manifest match. Unaccounted detainees. Incidents like this became more frequent. The SS, in retreat from collapsing positions in France and the Low Countries, increasingly turned to ad hoc prisoner transfers. Some of these were mass evacuations from satellite camps. Others were far less organized, comprising small groups of political prisoners or intelligence detainees who had been marked for special handling. These individuals, stripped of identity on paper, were shuffled between temporary holding sites and larger camps such as Bergen-Belsen or Neuengamme. By December, Friedrich Reimann's collection of falsified manifests and irregular entries had grown to over 24. He could no longer keep pace with the scale of the deception. Worse, he began to suspect that some of the errors were not just meant to obscure movement, but to erase it entirely. One case in particular troubled him deeply. Convoy G3644, which passed through Cell on December 12, listed a departure point from Luxembourg with a supposed cargo of industrial equipment. However, the assigned car numbers corresponded with a previous transfer, G3512, the same train that had originally drawn Reimann's attention in October. Identical cars, identical SS signatures, different routing. The implication was unavoidable. The same rolling stock with the same internal configuration was being cycled through new paperwork as if it were a different train. In reality, the cargo, very likely prisoners, was being moved in circles under fabricated identities. Whether to confuse oversight, delay liberation, or carry out systematic liquidation was unclear. Ryman flagged the case in his notes and made a duplicate copy of the G3644 manifest. He did not know it then, but this was the document later leaked through a third-party rail inspector in Bremen, and eventually passed into the hands of Swedish Red Cross contacts via neutral Swiss intermediaries. That process, though slow and oblique, would eventually result in formal inquiries from the International Committee of the Red Cross in early 1945. But for the moment, no such consequences loomed. Only growing internal contradictions. The strain reached its peak during the final week of December. An urgent night dispatch from the SS Office for Special Security Transfers demanded priority clearance for a new convoy, this one listed under Special Code K98/SS. The clearance signature came not from the regional SS liaison, but directly from a Hauptamt in Berlin. No train number was included, only a list of car assignments and the note, "Do not log in station record." This was unprecedented. Even the most secret SS trains typically maintained some form of routing identification. Ryman, troubled, chose to log the car numbers anyway, quietly, in his private ledger, and later on a copied sheet buried beneath layers of unrelated supply manifests. The cars passed through Celle under cover of dense fog. No engineer names were listed. No return routing was scheduled. Of the 13 freight cars involved, only 4 were recorded arriving at their supposed destination near Ludwigslust. The rest disappeared from the registry. At the year's end, Ryman sat in the dim dispatch office, reviewing the entries from the last quarter. He could see the erosion of the system in his own handwriting. Where once trains had followed coherent logic, now they diverged into blind routes, shadow designations, and reappearing identifiers. The Reichsbahn, once governed by clockwork precision, had become a tool of concealment. And concealment was breaking down under the weight of its own contradictions. Martin Kohler, meanwhile, had stopped asking questions. After a tense exchange with a visiting SS transport officer in early December, he had confined himself to routine tasks and rarely looked beyond the immediate dispatch orders. Ryman did not blame him. There were no answers to be found in the open. But the system was beginning to fracture. Somewhere within its failing mechanisms, someone would soon notice that certain car numbers didn't exist. That the same prisoners were being moved under different names. That entire trains had vanished from the network without trace. Ryman, ever cautious, continued to document. Not in protest, not in rebellion, but because the rules of the system had once mattered. And their breakdown now demanded a record, however quiet. In January 1945, Celle Station operated under the weight of near-constant emergency orders. Germany's Western Front was disintegrating under Allied pressure, while in the east, Soviet forces had launched their Vistula-Oder offensive, reaching the Oder River in a matter of weeks. With the Third Reich's military and administrative structure stretched to the point of collapse, its railways, still one of the last functioning arteries of state control, were pushed to their limits. Freight stations like Celle became not only logistical hubs but quiet choke points where the enormity of institutional failure began to make itself visible. Friedrich Ryman knew the Reichsbahn had become a theater of illusion. Train manifests no longer matched reality. Official routes often led to destroyed tracks or non-existent sidings. SS convoys passed without notice, or worse, under fabricated documentation that evaded all record. Ryman had tracked over 30 such irregular entries since September, each bearing false routing codes, phantom railcars, or duplicate clearance numbers. And yet none of these discrepancies had been officially challenged. Not by local authorities. Not by his superiors. That began to change in mid-January, when a Reichsbahn oversight delegation from Hanover arrived at Celle unannounced. Led by an older inspector named Werner Fuchs, the team was tasked with auditing several key junctions across Lower Saxony. Their purpose was ostensibly to assess capacity ahead of a new wave of military redeployments. But during their 2-day visit, Fuchs quietly pulled Ryman aside. "There are gaps in the central routing ledger," Fuchs said, leafing through a carbon copy of December's dispatch records. Trains logged as inbound from camps that were already evacuated. Others routed to terminals without functioning tracks. And this He held up a manifest Ryman recognized immediately, G3644. The reused designation from December with conflicting car numbers. This one appears in our Berlin records as both departed and cancelled. Ryman maintained a neutral expression. Then perhaps someone failed to update the routing. Or someone updated it too many times, Fuchs replied. His tone was even, but not unfriendly. Ryman paused. He could have let the comment pass. Could have simply nodded and said nothing more. But after months of silent observation, something shifted. I have copies of other manifests with similar issues, he said cautiously. I've been keeping private logs. For comparison. Fuchs regarded him for a long moment. Then, without comment, handed Ryman a folded piece of paper. It contained a list of train numbers and car assignments marked suspected irregularities, Lower Saxony region. At least 3 of the numbers matched Ryman's private ledger exactly. It was the first confirmation that someone outside Cell had been following the same trail. For Ryman, the implications were immediate. If the irregularities were known, then the concealment was no longer isolated. And if people were beginning to track them from within the Reichsbahn itself, the quiet documentation he had maintained for months was no longer just a personal record. It was now evidence. Over the next week, Ryman began assembling his notes into a more formalized report, not for any official channel, but as a coherent archive of the inconsistencies he had tracked. He included dates, train numbers, car assignments, clearance codes, and annotations about unexplained reroutings or missing documentation. The process required discretion. He typed portions of the report after hours using the station's requisitions typewriter and stored the pages inside a hollowed-out equipment manual in the workshop storage room. He said nothing to Kohler, nor to any of the other clerks. But decisions made in silence could not stay hidden forever. On the evening of January 24th, a convoy designated as K112/SS arrived at Cell's South Yard, rerouted from its original passage through Uelzen due to track damage. The manifest was hand-carried by an SS Sturmscharfer who refused to answer any logistical inquiries. The train included 17 sealed freight cars and a single unmarked passenger coach. No car numbers were listed on the accompanying documentation, only the order to expedite routing without record. Such a directive violated every Reichsbahn operational standard. Even SS transports, regardless of priority, required traceable documentation for safety and routing purposes. Ryman recorded the event in his private notes, as he had done before. But this time, he made a copy of the transport order itself, a carbon slip left behind by the SS courier during the brief fueling stop. That decision marked a turning point. 3 days later, on January 27th, 2 men in civilian overcoats arrived at Cell Station requesting an audience with the station master. They were accompanied by a Wehrmacht major whose identification bore the insignia of the Army's Transportation Command. Their tone was formal, but their questions were specific. Had any transports bearing classification beginning with K passed through Cell? Had any of them lacked official routing codes or used duplicate car identifiers? The station master, caught off guard, denied any knowledge. The visitors left without pressing the issue. But Ryman, watching from the freight office window, understood that the boundaries of the system had shifted. Whatever had once been compartmentalized within SS logistics was now drawing outside scrutiny, if not from Berlin directly, then from elements within the Wehrmacht and Reichsbahn attempting to assert control over a collapsing apparatus. That same evening, Ryman retrieved his assembled documentation and made a second copy. The original remained in Cell. The duplicate, wrapped in craft paper and tied with string, was passed discreetly to an intermediary, a former telegraph operator named Paul Wittke, who now worked on temporary assignment in the mail room. Ryman knew Wittke was sympathetic to church networks that had begun quietly documenting abuses within the Reich's detention system. He gave no explanation for the packet, only said it was for archival coordination. The risk, though small, was now real. Possession of falsified SS transport orders, even secondhand, constituted grounds for arrest. But Ryman made the decision not out of defiance. He had spent 2 decades serving the railways of Germany. He had witnessed their transformation under the Nazis, their weaponization, and now their corrosion. His report, with its meticulous details and cautious annotations, was an attempt to impose structure on a system sliding into bureaucratic obscurity. He continued his work as usual, logging train movements, adjusting for delays, and submitting standardized reports. But privately he watched for signs of reprisal. He took to carrying a small folded slip of paper with him at all times, an index of key train numbers and car assignments associated with the most egregious discrepancies. If ever questioned, he intended to present them as a simple study in efficiency, a technician's concern. By early February, the convoys had become fewer but more erratic. Some arrived with no documentation at all. Others departed with cars half full. A train that passed through Celle on February 6 under designation G3722 was reported in Bremen 4 days later under a different number, with 3 of its original cars missing. Reimann logged the change in silence. It was clear now that the SS transfer system was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own falsehoods. With the Allies closing in from all directions, the logistical tricks, duplicate manifests, circular routing, phantom cars, no longer guaranteed invisibility. Too many eyes were watching. Too many anomalies had accumulated. And somewhere in the system, someone had begun to listen. By mid-February 1945, the Third Reich's transportation matrix, once the pride of centralized military logistics, was unraveling under its own contradictions. The rail corridors of Western and Northern Germany bore the signs of exhaustion: scorched tracks, derailed wagons, bombed-out switching stations, and disoriented crews rerouting trains with no clear destination. But perhaps more telling than physical destruction was the administrative decay. Manifests no longer reflected reality, routing codes were obsolete within days, and in key depots like Celle, even basic assumptions about accountability had begun to fade. Friedrich Reimann observed this decline with quiet resolve. His private documentation, compiled over months, had now reached nearly 40 distinct entries detailing anomalous or falsified SS prisoner transfers. These were not random accidents. They formed a pattern: inconsistent origins, misnumbered cars, reused convoy IDs, and above all, the absence of any central record-keeping that reconciled these inconsistencies. He had come to see the Reichsbahn not as a malfunctioning machine but as a weapon of silence, capable of erasing people, not just moving them. The duplicate report he had passed to Paul Wick had, according to indirect word from a contact in Hanover, reached a Protestant intermediary working in a displaced persons registry. Nothing had returned officially. No feedback. No follow-up. But the knowledge that his findings were no longer contained within the walls of the Celle station changed the nature of his work. What had begun as methodical observation had become, without ceremony or declaration, a personal risk. That risk materialized on the morning of February 17th. 2 uniformed men from the Sicherheitspolizei, security police, arrived at the Celle station. Their arrival was unannounced, their tone precise. They requested access to the freight office's dispatch logs covering the period from October through January, with particular interest in convoys bearing SS routing clearances. The station master, visibly unsettled, complied immediately. Reimann, upon learning of their presence, excused himself from the switching console and retrieved a sealed folder from his locker, the sanitized, official version of the monthly logs. The officers reviewed the records without commentary. After nearly 2 hours, one asked whether any alternate copies of manifests had been submitted for cross-reference. Alternate copies? Reimann echoed, feigning confusion. Yes, the officer replied. Redundant logs, or corrections filed separately. Reimann shook his head slowly. All corrections are filed through the regional office in Hanover. We receive new routing instructions weekly. The exchange ended without incident, but it marked the first time that Reimann had to lie, directly and consciously, to authorities. The private ledger, stored in pieces across the workshop storeroom and a false panel in the electrical cabinet, remained untouched. Still, the visit sent a message. His notations had not gone unnoticed. Somewhere, someone had found the edges of the irregularities and begun pulling at the seams. Within a week, further pressure arrived, not from Berlin, but from within the Reichsbahn itself. A formal directive, marked DRB/Eilweisung 172a, arrived at all regional depots including Cell. It stated that, due to heightened security concerns, all transport manifests involving SS units or sensitive cargo were henceforth to be handled exclusively through SS liaison officers. Station personnel were ordered to cease independent record-keeping on such trains and were instructed to destroy any duplicate documentation not filed through official channels. This order was unmistakable in its intent. It was not a tightening of efficiency. It was a purge of oversight. Reimann read the directive in silence. He knew what it meant. The Reichsbahn was no longer being used simply as a facilitator of secret transfers. It was now being forcibly cut off from even acknowledging them. The network's last traces of bureaucratic transparency were being erased. He did not destroy his copies. Instead, he began transferring portions of his report into coded shorthand. Car numbers became alphanumeric sequences. Dates were encoded with reverse day/month markers. He created a set of false inventory tags that, if discovered, would appear to be coal weight records. These sheets he passed through internal mail couriers under the guise of forwarding monthly loading averages. A second copy went through a freight driver scheduled to pass through Göttingen, where a contact affiliated with a local railway workers' church network could pass it farther west. Reimann did not trust these copies would survive, but he acted on the principle that some record must persist. Meanwhile, the trains continued. In early March, a new convoy, G3781, arrived under the now familiar circumstances: sealed cars, blacked-out passenger coaches, missing car numbers, and an SS transport leader who refused to disembark. This time, however, there was a complication. A minor derailment in the southern yard forced the convoy to halt for inspection. When the maintenance crew opened one of the locked freight cars to assess axle damage, they found it empty, except for 6 discarded sets of prisoner clothing and a metal pail of frozen food remnants. The implication was chilling. The train had either offloaded its occupants at a location not logged in any schedule, or the car had been used temporarily for containment and then repurposed for the next phase of a concealed operation. The maintenance report included a neutral reference to unusual interior use, but no further inquiry was made. The incident was noted by Reimann and quietly cross-referenced against 2 other trains that had passed through Cell with similar car assignments. What emerged was a disturbing trend. Some of the SS convoys did not appear to be transporting prisoners from one site to another. Instead, they seemed to be acting as mobile holding cells, circulating individuals indefinitely across the rail network, beyond the jurisdiction of any camp, until a destination, if there ever was one, was no longer needed. To Reimann, this discovery struck at the core of what had begun months earlier as a technical concern. These were not simply administrative errors. They were logistical mechanisms of disappearance. The trains did not just misroute. They unmade records of the human beings they carried. Yet the institutional response to such observations, when they surfaced at all, was uniform: silence. After submitting his final February ledger, Reimann received a tersely worded reply from Hanover: station records for all restricted transfers are to reflect only confirmed arrival and departure stamps. Anomalies in routing are to be treated as operational variants. Do not submit supplemental remarks. The message was clear. Observations had become unwelcome. Precision was now a liability. Reimann did not stop recording, but he did begin preparing for what might follow. He transferred portions of his ledger to a coded notebook sewn into the cover of an old maintenance manual. He revised his annotations in older logs, removing overt comments and replacing them with symbolic shorthand. He minimized contact with Witt and Kohler, who had grown increasingly reticent and distant. And each morning, before logging new arrivals, he took a moment to recheck the electrical cabinet where the originals were hidden. Each action was small, each decision quiet, but they marked a shift. The risk was no longer abstract. He was now an archivist of events the system was trying to erase. One more convoy arrived on March 11th, its manifest missing, its SS escort unusually tense. Reimann noted the car numbers, all new. But the locomotive was not. It bore the same engine number as a convoy from January whose manifest had been marked "cancelled." He closed his ledger that night with deliberate care. The system was breaking, but it was still moving. In late March 1945, the rail traffic through Celle slowed to a fraction of its former volume. Allied air superiority made daytime movement increasingly difficult, and many SS-controlled transfers were either abandoned or rerouted eastward in haste. The Reichsbahn's internal communications had become fragmented, with regional offices issuing contradictory orders that often arrived too late to matter. In this environment, secrecy was no longer a carefully maintained system. It was an instinctive reflex, applied unevenly and without coordination. Friedrich Reimann remained at his post until the final days before Celle was reached by British forces. His work changed little in outward appearance. Trains were logged when they arrived. Tracks were assigned when they could be used. Delays were noted without explanation. But by April, the SS convoys that had once passed regularly through the yard had largely disappeared. Some were destroyed in transit. Others simply ceased to exist within the rail network, leaving no trace beyond scattered fragments of paperwork and abandoned rolling stock. On April 8, 1945, Celle was taken by British troops without significant resistance. The railway facilities were secured within hours. Reichsbahn personnel were ordered to remain on site pending review. Reimann complied, turning over official logs and equipment inventories as instructed. His private materials, the coded notebooks, hidden manifests, and duplicate reports, remained concealed. Within weeks, Allied investigators began reconstructing the movement of prisoners during the final months of the war. They worked from fragmentary German records, survivor testimony, and captured SS documents. In many cases, the trail ended abruptly. Entire groups of prisoners appeared in one location, then vanished from all records. It was during this phase that Reimann, acting through a British liaison officer assigned to rail transport analysis, disclosed the existence of his documentation. He did so without ceremony or accusation. He explained that the materials were incomplete, that they represented only what had passed through Celle, and that many details remained unclear. But the documents, particularly the duplicated manifests, reused car numbers, and falsified routing codes, provided something investigators had previously lacked: proof of a systematic method used to obscure prisoner transfers beyond the camp system itself. The material was forwarded to British and later international review bodies examining wartime deportations and disappearances. It helped corroborate survivor accounts from Neuengamme and Bergen-Belsen that described repeated, purposeless rail movements during the war's final phase. It also supported findings that certain SS transport units had operated independently of both the Reich Ministry of Transport and the formal concentration camp administration. Reimann was not prosecuted. He was not celebrated. After a brief debriefing, he returned to civilian life and retired quietly from railway service the following year. His name did not appear in trial transcripts or public reports. The documentation he provided was absorbed into broader investigative archives, cited sparingly and without attribution. The error that exposed the hidden system was, in the end, a simple one: a train manifest that did not match its own numbers. It was not an act of defiance, nor a deliberate challenge to authority. It was the product of routine work performed carefully by someone who noticed when a system no longer obeyed its own rules. In the aftermath of the war, many of the SS prisoner transfers he documented were never fully reconstructed. The rail network that had carried them had been designed to move goods efficiently, not to preserve memory. Yet fragments remained: ledgers, routing codes, and small discrepancies that refused to align. They survive today not as proof of heroism, but as evidence that even within systems built for concealment, accuracy can leave a trace. If you value careful historical documentation and the preservation of overlooked wartime records, consider supporting this channel so more forgotten stories like this one can be examined and preserved.